Welcome to this latest edition of the Ratcliffe Roundup. This is a human rights special, really, looking at the importance of human rights and their role in global geopolitics. With me, Mr. Lambert, the head of geography, Mr. Cantrell, head of history and politics, and then Praise, Joe and Ben, three of our senior Model United Nations delegates. So, why are human rights important, and where do our understandings of human rights come from?
So I think human rights do underpin everything. They matter in our daily lives, our lives in the future, and all the way into our past as well. I think over the years we've definitely seen human rights evolve and grow, and the protections on human rights grow exponentially over a period up until the last few years. But I think it would be fair to say in the last 5 years or so, especially since COVID and since the war in Ukraine, there have been times where human rights look like they are under attack. So any comment on that from anyone?
No, I think that's a really good point. I think, you take the history approach to it all, and we think about particularly the Second World War, don't we, and Hitler's Germany, but obviously not just there, Stalinist Russia and the like, and the rise of dictatorships and the loss of any kind of rights, really. Under the guise of the greater good for your nation or whatever that might be. And we saw the loss of rights there, and we see where that kind of goes in terms of the Holocaust, etc. And then, of course, we see the United Nations come through and try to look at that again and say, look, we can't ever let this happen again, can we? We've got to get some fundamentals for everybody in the world that we follow. And then that gets put in place, and the United Nations is there to try and uphold those things, of course. But of course, as you alluded to, Ben, we've now got a constant chipping away at those rights around the world. And again, depending on your political viewpoint, perhaps even at the moment with the government or previous government and current government thinking about looking at the Declaration of Human Rights and the European Declaration of Human Rights, and thinking that we may leave or want to be re-looking at how we interpret that, and that, that's potentially quite a scary thing. We might think it's quite sensible in certain instances, but of course, once you start chipping away at that, where does that?
Yeah, I think it's when you start that slippery slope. Where does it end up?
Got to remember the Universal Declaration was signed by the nations in 1948, so we're talking about something that is long established, but is going back to a very different time in history. Technology that we have today didn't exist, the ways of warfare, the ways of communication, and even if we see the evolution of warfare into kind of the information wars and communication wars and hacking and so on, there are those people who maybe question now the Universal Declaration, and not necessarily its importance, but if it's up to date enough to tackle the needs of the 21st century world.
I think that's a really strong point of how we've developed from that point. I think human rights are like the basis of society and what we build on. So I think they should always be evolving also to what new technology comes out and how to address it.
I think with human rights, we have a tendency to look at them as kind of a problem or an obstacle. And we were talking about earlier with this government and the previous government, it's often, we need to address human rights as a challenge to how we want to operate. But we always have to remember where they come from, in that you have, after World War II, you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ECHR, and it's all there to hopefully safeguard against governments doing something that obviously in hindsight we see is very bad. And so for us currently, it might be a bit of a hindrance, or, okay, we want to get rid of this migrant, or whatever the issue might be. But fundamentally, they are there as a safeguard, not a hindrance. And I think we probably need to bear that in mind more.
And I think, as you're saying, I think it's a really good point about potentially some people may see it as a hindrance. Well, of course, that's what, Hitler saw things as a hindrance, didn't he? And of course, we now see that, and I'll come back to the fact that the amount of democracies in the world now is reducing year on year and has been.
The democratic rating of
the democratic. I mean, I remember doing an assembly to the sixth form, I think a few years ago, which I'm sure you'll be treated to again now, which is forgetting about whether we forget our history. But one of the key points there is that Donald. This was before the recent Donald Trump presidency, but America is now seen on the at-risk register for democratic countries. Now, if they're the leaders of the free world and all the freedoms that they have, we have to ask ourselves how we've got into this situation and how it's still continuing to go there. And I think you're right. That should be the fundamental, shouldn't it? The human rights. People have fought very hard for those over the years, and they need to be preserved. But again, that's maybe the problem. If you want to change it, a bit like the American Constitution that we look at in politics, it's fine to change the Constitution, but what are you going to change it to? And the moment you start changing human rights, it'll be suiting one group or another group or something else. Well, it'll be used politically for one reason or another, and then it becomes very complicated as to what you can get as an agreed way forward.
Yeah, but just to play a bit of devil's advocate, could some people might be saying that because human rights have gone so far, that they're now actually being a hindrance themselves on people's freedoms.
What would you say is so far, as an example?
Well, I think just when people start it's not my personal political view, but I was just playing devil's advocate. But the fact that every time there's been several occasions where a government may have tried, in the UK especially, have tried to pass a law, and the human rights courts have said no, is that a hindrance on the UK Parliament's sovereignty and their right to pass a law for the British people?
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that was one of the potential similar arguments with Brexiteers, isn't it? With the European superstate as they would have seen it, or the EU to us. I guess so. But I suppose where you have to start is just everybody's basic right. So I presume it is a basic right for an education, to be given freedom of speech. I mean, the freedom of speech thing is a very big thing, which we could debate long and hard in a separate thing, isn't it? About whether people do have that nowadays. So I see your argument to that. I suppose all you can do is strip it down to its very basics and take it from there, which is what they did after the Second World War, I guess. But again, perhaps we do need to, as Mr. Lambert was saying before, perhaps we do need to look at it and see. But you've got to get a national approach to it. An international, a cross-party and an international approach to how you're going to do it if you do want to change it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, where do the greatest threats to the global stability of human rights come from in today's world? Is it from your archetypal bad guys, the Putins of this world waging war on Ukraine? Is it where you've got regional flashpoints such as the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo? There's and their clashes with Rwanda, Ethiopia and Eritrea in the news at the moment. So is it regional conflicts, or is it a more insidious, as Mr. Cantrell was hinting at, kind of erosion almost of democracy by those that are in charge in the Western world? We saw some backward steps under the previous government, didn't we, in terms of the right to assembly and peaceful protest and what was considered allowable or disruptive, and steps taken there. And the ongoing debate about migration in this country, as Mr. Cantrell said, Trump's attitude towards the media and attempts to control it in America. So where do the greatest threats come from?
I think it is interesting to look at the West rather than focus on, like Putin, to say, because the West carries this symbol of democracy, and they've carried that for a long time, and to see how some could say eroding would be as significant on other countries, obviously.
I think it's very important that we don't just look straight at Putin and be very critical of that and say, well, oh, that's rubbish, but look at us, we're absolutely fantastic. Because if you're sat and you look from their point of view, or if you're somewhere like China, you'd look at the UK and with all the flags at the moment and migrant protests, you say, well, that's not very welcoming to Chinese people. And, okay, we're doing lots of very bad stuff ourselves, but it's not like the UK is abiding by all the own rules that they set. Because we have to remember, obviously, human rights were constructed by mainly UK, USA lawmakers. If you're someone in Eritrea or Congo, it's not like you've had any say, really, in those human rights, and for you they might not be human rights because it's obviously a very cultural issue what rights are, and religious views and all sorts of views kind of melt into that. So we kind of look at it and go, oh, we're really good at human rights. Okay, maybe we could be better, but we're very good. But that's the human rights we've created ourselves, and we can't even fully subscribe to them. So looking at somewhere like Congo or China and going, oh, you're really rubbish at the human rights we created, it's a bit of a strange way we've constructed everything, really.
I suppose you'd say initially when they were made, all the countries did sign up to things, didn't they? That was, I think that's the thing. Everybody was supposed to sign up to those things, but it
was fed into by lots of different cultures. Was the most widely translated document ever, certainly at the time of writing.
And I think it's key to think that you would hope that all cultures would value, and many of the human rights are universal, and it's not something which one culture might say and one culture might not say. You'd hope that all cultures would abide by.
And I think you're right. I think most people, the majority around the world, would value those things, but whether or not governments or
people in power,
or individual people in power, that's perhaps when these rights do become inconvenient to them, and that's when you can chip away and say, yes, but of course every time you say yes, but what's to stop the next government saying yes, but?
Especially when you say yes, but then there's no action behind that. I think that's where you can say I don't agree with that, but then there's no action.
I think the immigration thing in this country is probably the certainly for us maybe the most current example of rights internationally and stuff, do they? And having this, we signed up to say that if somebody is desperate and they and their family are in desperate trouble or going to be killed or something like that, we have a right and responsibility to accept them here. But then, of course, it's fueling huge arguments.
There's ongoing debates about what constitutes a safe country when you're looking at returns or looking at asylum applications, and that is contested and protected by things like the European Convention, and the UK government is wanting to potentially make its challenges on certain clauses within that, but how far they will get. And there's a discord, isn't there, between what they believe a lot of the public want. The current government is obviously responding to the pressure of the Conservatives and reform and the public dialogue on immigration to change tack. But at the same time, there will be a lot of people watching this very closely to look at how the human rights of all involved are preserved and protected as well.
Yeah, and what I think is very interesting when looking at it is how much the Labour Party have changed over the last 5 years. Because when you saw when they were in opposition, Rishi Sunak proposed a plan to send migrants to Rwanda, calling that a safe country, and he got loads of abuse from the Labour leaders, basically saying that it was a human rights issue. And now they've come into power and they are solving the human rights issue in a very similar way. Maybe not exactly, but...
Well, there was a subtle thing in the speech yesterday from the Home Secretary which did refer, but without any exemplification, to sort of return arrangements with certain countries.
Yeah.
It's very interesting if we look at the UK and migration specifically as like a example of human rights. It's a very strange kind of mix that we've got into where everyone's kind of being driven by the most extreme viewpoints of people that are like, oh, it's absolutely we should be accepting migrants and absolutely we shouldn't. And we've kind of lost all sorts of moderation as to what actually is happening. Because, of course, looking at human rights, and it speaks to your point about them being written in 1948 and subsequent to that being amended, and things like it should be the first safe country. Well, clearly, the UK is not the first safe country for anybody, because it's not like anyone's fleeing France because there's some sort of disaster there. So it purely on a human rights basis, some people would argue, well, we shouldn't be taking any migrants at all in terms of refugees. But then equally you could say, well, we have a moral obligation to take some. And then, you, as Ben was saying, you have the Labour Party who were previously very opposed to lots of measures about migration, who have suddenly kind of either realised that it's a major issue to lots of people, or realised we kind of need to do something about this, otherwise reform, etc., are going to grow.
Well, off the point of human rights, is this not democracy? Is this not the fact that it's becoming a greater and greater issue, and it's political suicide not to do something about it?
A government should represent the will of the people to a degree, shouldn't it?
Or for those that do politics, is it the dictatorship of the masses?
Yeah, I think there's the argument that some governments opt for the belief of we're a trustee, and that means that we're going to do what we think is right for the people, even if it's not what they want. So you saw that in the run up to, or in the time after Brexit, with the MP Ken Clarke. He was quite local to here at school, and despite his constituents voting in favour of Brexit, he kept a staunch anti-Brexit stance throughout his entire time in Parliament before being removed from the Conservative Party by Boris Johnson, but that's another story. So so it's interesting to look at whether should the politicians do what the people want or what would be best for the people in the long term.
We've meandered off the human rights.
I think the one thing I would say is, if to the average Ratcliffe student who may be listening to this, I think we're very fortunate that we go through our lives, really for the most part, not having to think about what are our human rights, because our human rights are not being challenged. You know, it's only when you find yourself denied of those rights that they perhaps become more central to your thinking. But, you know, why is it that the average Ratcliffe student should care about things like the Universal Declaration or the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which protects everyone up until the age of 18? Why is that really important to them? Why are they not disconnected from it?
I think for a school like Ratcliffe in particular, where we have people from all over the world here, we have borders that literally come from all continents bar Antarctica, and because human rights don't apply to you in the sense of they're not being breached, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people we come in contact with don't have that same luxury. And equally, it's important to remember that, for instance, there are people here that are obviously Catholic. If they were to go somewhere like I don't know, Afghanistan, and they were going to go for a little sunny walking holiday, they probably wouldn't be treated with utmost respect. So even though, to put it mildly, even though they might not be, their human rights not be kind of contravened currently, that doesn't mean to say that they wouldn't be if they kind of went abroad or elsewhere.
I think also the second people stop talking about human rights, that's when the risk is that if we're not talking about it, people won't realise if any changes occur to their human rights. And the more you talk, the more you're aware, and that means the more, even if you're doing it actively or inactively, you're influencing human rights policy.
I think it was interesting a few years ago, wasn't there, when we had one or two students from the Ukraine when they came over. Yes. And of course, if you spoke to them, they were very firmly in favour, as we did in history, very, very much in favour of the Declaration of Court of Human Rights and all of these kind of things, because I suppose when it's happening to you and your family and the like, perhaps it comes more pressing, and perhaps we are just apathetic about it because we're lucky.
Yeah.
Maybe
I think it's important to realise the privilege that you have to be born in the place you are and go to the school you do. Just because your human rights aren't in jeopardy doesn't mean maybe your friends or someone you know or someone even you don't know is. And I think just because it doesn't happen to you doesn't mean it's no longer, important.
And as we all go through our life, we want that freedom of self-determination, of expression, of speech, the freedom to apply for jobs and go into careers where you won't be discriminated against because of age or gender or sexuality. We want the freedom to essentially to be ourselves and live that life peacefully. And, again, it's very easy to take it for granted when that's not being challenged. But, when it is, it's important then that you know that there is something that is there to safeguard you. So.
Well, I think we've come round to the fact, ultimately, that human rights are really important for us, aren't we? And that basically we just need to, because we are lucky to be in the country that we are, we perhaps maybe take them for granted and maybe need to think about them a little bit more. And it's a more complicated debate often than it seems.
And that's probably why things like MUN are very important, in that they make us address issues from all sorts of points of view. And for instance, last year we were obviously Somalia as one of our countries. Yeah. It's very important to look at an argument from all points of view and also have to address these issues. They're very uncomfortable for a lot of people, but having to address them is very important. So I think they're it's very important that we continue talking about them at Ratcliffe.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to look at someone else's situation, someone else's country, and see how the rules here or the policies here differ, and how human rights can come into conflict, obviously.
I think
And that, folks, I think is a wrap.
Yeah,
thank you.
so, thank you. If you like this video, if you're watching it on YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on any of our social medias, and thank you, and we'll see you next week as well. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.